right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our monthly COVID-19 Empower Hour here at African Services Committee. If you're joining us here for the first time, the COVID-19 Empower Hour is a monthly discussion on COVID-19 related topics, where we talk about how to keep yourself safe from COVID-19, for example, how the COVID-19 vaccines work, common COVID-19 myths, and where we answer also any questions from members of the community. My name is Kenneth Cruz, and I'm a community health worker here at ASC, and I'll be hosting this month's April English session. And today's format is slightly different from previous formats because we're lucky enough to have a special guest today, Dr. John Agley, who we will be hearing from in a few minutes. Good morning, Dr. Agley, how are you?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Doing well. Before we get started, for those of you who might be new to the series, I'd like to introduce African Services Committee, what we do in the community, and what we have to offer you. If you prefer French or Spanish, we will be hosting the French session on April 27th and the Spanish session on April 29th. So for those who are joining us for the first time, African Services Committee is a multi-service human rights agency in Harlem dedicated to assisting immigrants, refugees, and asylees from across the African diaspora. We provide free, confidential health, housing, legal, social welfare, education, nutrition, and advocacy services, regardless of your immigration status or ability to pay. If you're interested in testing services, ASC also offers those in the form of at-home COVID-19 test kits. You can call the number that's on the screen, 1212-222-3882 for availability of these test kits. And we recommend calling before you come in, just to ensure that we actually have them in office because they tend to go fast. If you have any specific COVID-19 questions though, before you get tested, you can call our helpline at 1706-502-9163, and that's in English and French. For our Spanish speakers, you can call us at 1-862-248-2864 at our Herschel team helpline. You can also leave a voicemail or send a text to either of these numbers at any time, and replies will be sent back on Mondays through Fridays, 1 through 4 p.m. For any questions regarding COVID-19 vaccinations specifically though, you can go ahead and contact our Herschel team at the number 1-862-248-2864, or reach out to us via email at covidvaxoutreach@africanservices.org. So a little bit about today's agenda for today's English session. We will be hearing from Dr. John Agley as we have a discussion about COVID-19 misinformation and the role it plays in this pandemic. We will also be answering questions at the end. So please, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box and we'll get to answering them at the end. Again, at any point, feel free to leave a question and then we'll get to those questions or comments at the end. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Agley and cover a little bit of his background and the work that he does. Dr. Agley is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Health Science at IU School of Public Health Bloomington, and Deputy Director of Research at Prevention Insights, a center within that department. His academic training includes degrees and/or focus areas in English literature, medieval studies, public health, and health behavior and philosophy. He is dedicated to translational research and practice, working to apply best practice innovations and discoveries in the field, while still retaining a passion for discovery. A particular note in light of the topic of his fireside chat is that he has leveraged his multidisciplinary background and drawn wisdom from his colleagues, mentors, and students alike to design and conduct multiple studies on trust in science and scientists and belief in scientifically unsupported narratives about COVID-19. Again, thank you so much, Dr. John Agley, for joining us today. It's really great to have you here. And we look forward to having a great discussion. Yeah, so let's get started right away. Can you tell us a little bit about your research on COVID-19 and misinformation?
Sure. So this was kind of an unexpected area for me, although it dovetails with a lot of what I was doing when I was a doctoral student. so campus shut down, for a lot of people around the same time who are working at universities. I think I want to guess March 13th or somewhere thereabouts. And I went home and I was like everyone else, I was kind of watching the news, and I was hearing people say epidemiology on the news, which didn't happen that often, believe it or not, before 2020. And I was thinking, well, this is something that may really change how people think about science and scientists. They're seeing these scientific processes happen in real time. And I was getting really excited, but part of the scientific enterprise is we try not to assume about things. So I did a small study, and I found out that actually trust in science really wasn't going up at all. And I went to double check on that. And by that time it was April. And but also by that time, there was a lot of misinformation or unsupported narrative discussion about COVID. And so I realized it would be important to dovetail information about trust in science with how people think and believe about unsupported narratives. And for what it's worth, I use the term unsupported narrative because misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theory all tend to get used interchangeably. And I think each of those has a good purpose. But when I say an unsupported narrative, I'm talking in the sense of ambiguity. So it's like, well, we're very certain, for example, that COVID is not transmitted by 5G. So that would be unsupportive or unsupported. But then there are other things where we're fairly certain or moderately certain that things work in a certain way. But so that's why I'm using that terminology. So what I found out essentially is that there is this, or there appears to be an association between trust in science and scientists and the kind of narratives that people believe about COVID. And specifically, and I know you wanted to talk about the belief profiles later, so we'll get into that later, but people who were more likely to believe scientifically supported narratives and be a little more skeptical of unscientific narratives were also those who trusted science. And that was true even in models incorporating variables like politics and religion that often are seen as being associated with belief in those kind of narratives. And so that led me to the idea of, can we do an intervention where we look at trust in science? And there is, a whole slew of research that came out of that, and how do we articulate information about the scientific enterprise, and how do we talk to people about scientists? And I'm certainly not the first person to ask these kind of questions, but obviously with COVID being new, there was a number of people, myself and the team we have put together included, who are very interested in looking at this.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So, I mean, it is, I think you said it best when you mentioned how some of these topics coming out now are not typically in the news and in the mainstream. And now there's a bigger spotlight on issues like this. In your opinion, informed by your work and your research, do you think belief in, our next question, I guess, do you think belief in unsupported narratives or misinformation is a global challenge?
Well, okay. So let me take a step back real quick. So I'm gonna, obviously it's, part of trust in science and scientists is not stepping beyond what you know. And so I'll say I have not specifically researched COVID-19 misinformation in a global context. That doesn't mean I don't have thoughts that I'll share, but it does mean I'm going to try to be very, very particular about saying, these are things that I found in my research versus these are ideas that I have that I think are worth discussing. So in this case, these are ideas that I have. These aren't things that came directly out of my own research. I think that the idea of unsupported narratives has existed long before COVID, and there was a whole set of procedures for studying this called infodemiology that's been advanced by a number of scholars, and they've made it pretty clear that there are all kinds of narratives that are not necessarily supported that get shared all the time. The main difference, I think, globally is that we often see, or at least I often see when I'm reading studies that are similar to my own, but in other countries, I see that there's some variance in the kinds of things, the kinds of unsupported narratives that are popular. But, I think that the challenge remains globally. It's just the way the challenge manifests, how it looks, how the communication is structured looks very different depending on where you are, or it can look very different.
Yeah, which is actually goes into our next question pretty seamlessly, which is, in your opinion, how prevalent of an issue do you think misinformation is in other languages such as Spanish or French?
I would speculate that, to the degree that it's the primary spoken language in other countries, you would identify that. There are some studies that I'm familiar with that I think do a good job of illustrating how those differences appear. There was a really good study from last year that looked at how often different topics of COVID misinformation appear in China, India, the US, Germany, and France. And they found 750 articles or so that they chose to study that had either clearly inaccurate or misleading or pseudoscientific claims about the vaccine or treatment, stuff like, you can consume silver particles to kill COVID. And so they found that, there was a really disproportionate number of kind of pseudoscientific treatment articles in France, 205 versus 96 for the US. But when you looked at articles that had COVID misinformation with a political tone, it was something like so-and-so is responsible, so-and-so did something. There, the US had more than half of the articles that had that kind of stuff, but that was much less common in France. Wow. So even though, both countries had kind of some number of articles that were advancing these ideas, the nature of that discussion, what was quite different. In France, it's not to say that one idea didn't appear in the other country, but at least what this study found is that, there's some countries where maybe the misinformation is more on the medical side. In the US, it tended to be more on kind of an accusatory side of things. And we know that there was this analysis done of French adults, and they did find that the ability to detect fake news in French was correlated with vaccine acceptance for COVID, which is fairly similar to some of the studies we've seen in the US and Canada on the same stuff. And then, in parallel, there was another really interesting study that I'm familiar with that looked at susceptibility to kind of what they call misinformation or unsupported narratives in Ireland, Mexico, Spain, the UK, the US, and they kind of found the same differences across, between English and Spanish speaking countries. There they found, trust in the government was associated with susceptibility to misinformation in the US, but not in Spain or Mexico. Whereas trust in journalists was correlated in both Spain and Mexico with susceptibility to misinformation, but not in the US. So, all that is to say, the overall milieu is is similar around the world would be my speculation. But I think that the way it looks is going to be highly influenced, or at least appears to be highly influenced by kind of these local particularities, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because I mean I think it's significant, this issue of misinformation and how it exists in other languages, particularly because we are a multilingual organization and work with communities from different regions of the world, speak all these different languages. So it's important to contextualize this information not as just, you know, a problem that's running rampant in the English-speaking media and hemisphere, but perhaps also an issue to different degrees, but nevertheless an issue in Spanish and French circles and media circles. You mentioned believability profiles earlier, though, so that's something that I really wanted to touch upon for anybody who's listening to this. Could you tell us what are believability profiles for anybody who's not familiar with your work, and what can they tell us about COVID-19 misinformation specifically?
Sure. So the way that the studies we did were structured was that we asked people, we presented people with statements about COVID, just kind of with some lead in, but we didn't say, here are some statements that we don't agree with, or here are some statements we do agree with. We just presented them with, you know, people think different things about COVID, and, you know, tell us how believable you find these kind of things, kind of a fairly standardized way of getting at how believable people find ideas to be. And we asked things like, you know, and we've done this a couple times at this point, but the very first study we asked, you know, or one of the statements was, you know, 5G can transmit COVID. And so they would indicate how believable they find that statement to be on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is extremely unbelievable and 7 is extremely believable. So if a person was, say, very skeptical of the idea that 5G can transmit COVID, they would pick a 1. And then in later studies, after face masks became kind of more of a flashpoint than they were early on, you know, we had a statement about face masks causing carbon dioxide poisoning, which we know they don't. But this respondent may be a little more unsure. You know, they know viruses aren't transmitted through, you know, cellular signals, but they don't really know much about face masks. So they might pick a 3 or a 4. So they're like, it's plausible. We're still on the skeptical side, but it's plausible, and so on. So what we ended up with is these data sets where people had told us for all these different statements how believable they found the narratives to be. And then with that, and tell me if I'm getting too technical because I'm kind of a nerd. So this is interesting to me. So we used a statistical approach called latent profile analysis. And to me, this is the cool part, even though I'm not that cool. But for this approach, we're not starting with assumptions about people. And that's what I really like about it. And instead, we're just taking that data on beliefs and how believable people found different narratives. And then we're looking for clustering. So essentially, are there groups of people who are responding in similar ways? And there's a lot of technical parts to it that we don't need to get into, but ultimately, we can come to a general observation about, you know, for this specific sample with these specific questions, here is how their believability data kind of group them together. So in our first study, for example, we had 5 statements about COVID. And our analysis showed us that people in the sample generally responded in 4 different ways. So even though people could pick, you know, 1 through 7 for each of those 5 questions, many people responded in consistent ways, and there were 4 consistent ways. So 70% of the whole sample responded in one particular way. So they totally rejected the 5G statement. It was uniformly picked a 1, which is pretty remarkable, actually. They were very skeptical of a statement about Bill Gates. The average was like 1.4, so still very, very skeptical. They were a little more open to statements about, the idea that it was developed as a weapon, or that it was used as a plausible way to restrict liberty, but wasn't that dangerous, like in the mid 2s. So still they don't find it very believable, but they're acknowledging in those cases, we're not 100% certain, we're more 90% certain.
Yeah.
And then we had a statement about the zoonotic origin, and that had an average score of 5.8. So, and this was important because this is research on trust. We didn't say this is the profile that's right. We said this is the profile that is most consistent with current scientific evidence and narratives to the best of our ability to determine that. And then there were some other profiles that kind of had, higher scores for the 5G theory or the other narratives. What was really interesting to us, and I know you wanted to talk about this later too, but we were surprised that there wasn't any profile that really was rejecting the zoonotic origin narrative. And instead, the main differences were the degree to which people found other narratives to also be plausible at the same time. And when we redid the study in a different sample, different platform, we added a couple additional narratives, like I mentioned about face masks, and when we redid the study, that same finding held true, which is to say that people tended to believe or find that the zoonotic statement was fairly believable across all the different profiles. And the variation was, they found that to be plausible and other things to be plausible, versus finding that to be plausible and some of the other narratives to be less plausible. And so I'm trying, it's hard for me not to get technical because that's just the, kind of the world I live in. So please feel free to jump in and ask for any clarifying information. But the value of looking at things in this way is to understand, instead of just seeing for each individual person, here's how believable things are found, to be able to look at kind of this broader sense and get a broader sense of how these beliefs and how believability of these statements kind of fits together to kind of see the forest instead of the trees.
And from that, the implication, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you don't necessarily have to have disbelief in one narrative to believe another. You can hold both of those beliefs simultaneously. Right.
And I think, and that's something that had been found with earlier research, not about COVID, that would look at kind of conspiracy theories, is that people could and often did believe conspiracy theories that directly contradicted each other about various things in the mid 2010s or whatever. And I can get into this a little later too, but we actually used a similar methodology to look at a different health issue, and we found almost not the exact same pattern, but we found a very similar pattern where, when you ask people about how believable things are, that's different than asking them to say that things are definitely true. So I think someone could say, I think it's pretty likely that this happened, but it's also likely that happened. And even though they contradict, it's not that the person is necessarily being illogical. It's that they're saying, I think either of these could be true. They're not necessarily saying, I think both of these are true at once.
Yeah, which is I mean, really interesting considering I think people think now, or people have commonly thought that you believe one thing and that's what that's where your belief is, and for people who are believing these unsupported narratives, the goal is to have them not believe those narratives. But if they're believing multiple things at once, then it's a little bit more complicated than that.
It's very complicated.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings us into our next question. What is digital literacy, and what role does digital literacy play in addressing misinformation and building trust in science?
Sure. So let me again step back and say that I've looked at a lot of digital literacy literature in preparing for the studies that I've done, but I didn't necessarily incorporate digital literacy per se,
Sure.
although I think it's very linked to the idea of trust. So there's a good recent conceptualization of digital literacy that I like a lot. And I'll give you the direct quote here because I pulled it up for you. Online information discernment combined with the basic digital skills necessary to attain it. And that's from a preprint paper by Drs. Guess and Munger. And I like that because it's basically the ability to kind of determine what is plausible online. And then also, and this is important, the ability to gather the information that would enable that decision about plausibility to be made. And in fact, one of the two professors who came up with that statement actually had done a study in the past on the effects of tips on spotting what they called at the time false news. And they found that there is evidence that shortfalls in this digital media literacy are an important factor in why people believe misinformation. And again, that's the direct quote of that professor's finding. And so to me, my suspicion is that there is some interplay with trust in science, but I don't have any definitive information about how it manifests. On a basic level, you have the simple case of a person scrolling through a social media feed, and there are questions about whether people believe the post they see. And there is actually a seemingly separate question of whether they choose to share it, whether they believe it or not. And there's an entire body of work that's been developed and is still being developed by a couple professors, Doctors Pennycook and Rand, and a couple others are fairly well known at this point, for, among other things, looking at the difference between whether people believe something, whether they share it on social media.
Yeah, which is funny enough, the next question that you're basically answering.
Well, let me, if you don't mind, let me go back one more second. Well, it'll be more than a second, but yeah. So because I anticipate what your next question is, so I'm going to try to dovetail these a little bit, if that's okay. I will stop there on the core concept of digital literacy and say there are some great experts out there whose work I think is very good. So, to learn more about that in particular, I think probably read that rather than listening to me. But I think there is this kind of interplay between literacy and trust. And I'll share an anecdote. I've experienced kind of a spectrum of the complexity of detective work that needs to be done. So let's take the example of a friend or family member sending me a post or article and asking, hey, is this true? Which, the more you post about, unsupported narratives and stuff like that, the more people might ask you that kind of stuff. And there's sort of a level one response, which is to apply some basic principles of digital literacy: quality of the source, where's the information hosted, is the claim extreme? Think about the aphorism, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and and so forth. even here, there is some discretion as to what sources and information hosts might be trusted. But if I'm in a rush and I don't have a lot of time, I might just respond to the family member with something like, oh, fan, I'm a little concerned about X and Y. Look at Z if you want to learn more. So that's the kind of the quick thing. And there's a lot of digital literacy there, but I want to point out that there's an implication, which is that I was trusted by the family member to interpret the science. Then there's a, kind of a more in-depth response if they say, hey, we really want you to look at this. In one case, I recall being asked to check a nutrition claim, and it was linked to a blog post. The blog post linked to a website. The website has a news-looking article alongside an online marketplace selling products. And that news-looking article linked to a peer-reviewed abstract. And the scientific abstract, the title, was plausibly related to the claim, but if you looked at the abstract alone, it was very clear the article had nothing to do with what they were claiming. So they kind of had used the ambiguity of the title as a means to kind of make a case. And I think that's still kind of getting at digital literacy, although there is, now it's the skill set to dive really deep. And then there's what I call a level 3 response. And please note, I don't, these levels are arbitrary ordinal metrics I'm using to structure the conversation. There's not like a rule to these or anything. So I've sensed a bleeding over from this digital literacy to scientific literacy and also principles of trust. So let's say we follow that hyperlink rabbit hole down and get the article itself. And here we get to this series of philosophical questions. Would we expect people in general to have a sense of the quality of an academic journal? There's this debate between so-called predatory journals and non-predatory journals, and that's not even clearly defined. And there's not really any consensus that I've seen to a great level of satisfaction as to what constitutes predatory journalistic practice. I'm not sure that looking or assessing academic journal quality is part of general digital literacy. Has the article been retracted, and is there any note that it's been retracted? Have scientists who are trustworthy, who have demonstrated discernment in making decisions, expressed concerns, and have they justified those concerns with well-reasoned arguments? If the article is new, are there concerning signs in the article? I remember one time last year where almost every reference in the first couple paragraphs of the introduction had nothing to do with what they were writing about. That's a huge red flag. And there are also times where I'll read through an article that does some preliminary stuff and I'll think, that's really interesting. I hope there's a lot more studies on this so we can understand better. But then the conclusion might be really intense. Like it might be, we now know X and we have to behave accordingly. So here we're not in, this is beyond digital literacy and beyond scientific literacy, and actually gets into kind of epistemology and orientations about science. So I went through all that to illustrate a few points that I promise dovetail with your next question. It can be extremely time consuming to investigate even a single claim at a reasonable level of thoroughness. And there's no guarantee when you're done investigating that you're right. You just are more confident. And I think that involves some principles of this digital literacy style detective work, some components of scientific literacy and so forth. And no one really has the time, skills, and energy to investigate every claim they're presented with. And that's why, I go back to the textbook called The Philosophy of Trust, and the description of the book begins with, trust is central to our social lives. We know by trusting what others tell us. And that's because no one has the time, skills, and energy to investigate all these claims. And so who we trust helps us form our conceptualization of what is. And that's why I think that, the ability to access things on something like social media has a lot to, and what we believe does have a lot to do with trust, because who we trust to make accurate statements will influence what we believe, because of the, unabashed fact that we cannot investigate everything ourselves.
Yeah, and you bring up an excellent point of what the core of the issue really is, and it's kind of this expedience on information, or this expectation of expedience of information. Nobody has time when they come across a post on social media or nobody thinks they have enough time to go through the investigation, especially if at the end of it you don't find an answer that's 100% true, or something that you can say is 100% true. If we could just go to the next question. So you kind of touched upon how, social media platforms kind of are hosting this, they're kind of the host for this expectation of expedience information, which plays into people's expectation of information being true if it's coming from somebody they trust. It's almost as if there's this bystander effect where they see something that you post and you share, and they assume it's true because you must have done your work. Well, maybe you didn't, but then you trusted the source that it came from, and you assumed that it came from there, and so on and so forth. But something that I really wanted to touch upon, if we could just go to the question after this one, is unlike open social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, content shared on closed messaging platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal tend to be more private. So there's not this, there's not this factor of, oh, I know you, you know me, and we kind of share ourselves there. What kind of approach can we take to combat misinformation in these areas?
So there's, as you might expect, this kind of gets into an area where there's been less research that's been done. There have been some interesting studies that have focused on information shared in group chats. And I know that basically I would categorize this as, again, two separate issues, even within just these closed messaging platforms, one of which is group chats and the other of which is individual one-on-one conversation. And so, like I said, there have been a few things where people have looked at group chats, and the models that people are advancing for that looked at, to what degree are things like fact checking applicable? And the answer is, it's the only way that feasibly happens in a kind of closed messaging group chat is social checking or social surveillance, where people, there may be someone who has some kind of cachet in that social group, and they're, saying, hey, that's not true, but you don't have the same kind of, quote unquote fact checking or flags that you do on the larger platforms. Now, I want to emphasize, this is my opinion here, but it's not clear to me that the fact checking or flags is the quote unquote the way to do attenuation of misinformation. I think there are times when it's helpful, but it's very difficult to, as we talked about, it's very time consuming to fact check things, and you can't predict what kinds of things people will say or do. And so that's why I'm an air quotes fan of inoculation theories of various kinds for something like misinformation. So, even if things are clearly true and false, so there's no gray space or ambiguity, where, one issue with fact checking is if something is probably not true, but there's still a chance it might be, you can't really fact check that so much as like uncertainty check it. And that's, I think we kind of get lost in that. But even if we have things that are clearly true or false, we can't always anticipate what people are going to say. So to me, the alternative approach is to help people reach a place where they can ask critical questions about what they hear and see and determine what is likely to be true or meaningful. And even beyond that, there's a question of incentives and interest. If a person has the tools to do intensive fact checking on their own, what's the incentive to do it?
Yeah.
Especially in cases where the opinion or claim already fits nicely with their worldview or heuristic for decision making. You know, if someone shares with me a meme about donuts and how they have some kind of unexplored feature that helps me get healthier, I'm obviously going to be skeptical of that claim, but there's going to be a part of me that says, man, I really hope that's true because I love donuts. So I have, you know, kind of less of, even though I'm a very skeptical person by nature, I have less of incentive to check that because it fits in kind of with my worldview already. So I guess that's a long way of saying I'm not definitively sure how to address misinformation in private conversations. And I think I would be frankly uncomfortable with the idea of restricting language or chat in venues like that at all. I think probably one potential solution is to just work toward a world of motivated individual, mini scientist detectives, where people have the skills to rigorously investigate things, but also the motivation and drive to do it. And I suspect that would really require people to be excited about knowing things and pursuing truth, to value very highly not winning an argument per se or having a gotcha moment, but in working with others to identify what is about the world, what is true and correct.
Does working to that, and then if you can go to the next question, does that include what you've kind of mentioned in your research of showing people scientifically correct explanations before they're exposed to misinformation, in an effort to prevent them from believing misinformation in the future? Kind of, you were touching upon this idea of inoculation against misinformation. Is that something that you think we can implement? Is there a way that we can use this to help prevent widespread belief in misinformation in the future?
Yeah, I think so. I think to some of it is a caution about ways not to do it. So, when we observe people with high believability for the zoonotic explanation, for example, but also for other narrative statements about origin, what that tells us is that there may be, if people already find the zoonotic narrative to be believable, then telling them that the narrative exists, or providing, incremental support for that, there may be some value in that. But I also wonder whether it really, the degree to which it changes their believability of other narrative statements. So, for example, if I'm currently living in Indiana, I cannot also be living in North Carolina. And those are clearly oppositional structures. But if I'm currently living in Indiana, it's not impossible that I take vacations to outer space every year. It's highly improbable. Very few people travel to space. You could do a quick internet search, find out I'm not even, in the realm of people who go to space. So if you go and you convince people that I currently live in Indiana, you may, to some degree, reduce their belief that I live in North Carolina, but you may not have any effect at all on the suspicion that I'm secretly taking vacations to space, because those ideas are, maybe related in some ways, but they're not contradictory. It's very possible to find both claims plausible. And so our caution was only that relying on emphasizing the evidence for specific scientifically supported statements may be insufficient to address other concerns about believability. It's just really complex. So let's talk about that other health information study I talked about that used these believability profiles. So there we found that each of the profiles tended to believe that the intervention worked. So we were asking about a specific intervention. Uniformly, people thought it worked, that it effectively reduced harm. And that belief is very consistent with the evidence that we have about the intervention. Where the profiles differed was that some people also believed that while it reduced harm in the intended area, it would cause this other large problem. Now that concern has been fairly extensively debunked, that it would cause this other large problem. But we, there we found the largest latent profile of the believability profile was that no one was doubting that it helped, problem A. And the resistance was coming from the belief that even though it helps A, it hurts B.
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter how much we explain that it helps A, that's not getting at the actual root, core of the opposition to the intervention, which is that this other misunderstanding. And so, this conflates a lot of constructs, and I'm not clear how helpful I'm being, but I think the core takeaway is that all of these issues are incredibly complex. And we can't assume that just by repeating one thing that's true, that it affects other people's beliefs and values and things of that nature, because the systems that we use to make decisions and to think about information are complicated. And this gets back to that idea of fostering a kind of world of scientists. Mm-hmm. Again, this is my opinion. I'm not so sure it's about these small wins. We got someone to do X, and I especially am skeptical of these small wins at the cost of trust. Mm-hmm. It's about, science is about pursuing truth and teaching people how to pursue truth and reminding them the value of doing so. And so I think it's also very important that we be trustworthy in doing that.
Something that comes up often when we do community outreach and we're out in the community talking to people is, if we can go to the next question, how can we build trust in science, also addressing deeply rooted medical mistrust in these communities, in these Black and Brown communities?
It's a hard question for me to answer because I think, to me, a lot of questions are hard to answer because I always want to have, this really high standard of evidence. and yeah. For tough questions, we often have ambiguity. And hopefully I'm presenting a reasonable amount of ambiguity with these answers. This question is very consistent with a paper that was raising dialogue about vaccination decisions. The paper was called, and I can't emphasize something in verb, addressing justified, mm-hmm. and that's not an air quote, that's an emphasis. Addressing justified vaccine hesitancy in the Black community was the name of the article, and it was kind of a call for dialogue on this. There was a focus group study in 2020 by a doctor, and I'm going to get the French name wrong, named Montplaisir, and a team that identified some of the issues that were raised. And some of those things were the same kind of issues that we were observing that were associated with general trust in science and those kind of narratives, things like the speed of development, side effects, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So those issues were still identified by the focus groups in these specific communities, but there were other issues layered on top of that, such as medical mistrust, the political environment in 2020. Mm-hmm. And so that's actually really consistent with, we did a study on vaccination likelihood in January 2020, and we found that trust in science was strongly associated with intention to get vaccinated for COVID, but so was self-reported racial identity. Mm-hmm. And as expected, lower trust in science was associated with lower intention to get vaccinated, but there was additional variance in the model that was explained by identifying as Black or African American. And so, I think what we see there is, it's not that it's one kind of issue of trust or another. It's that, the data suggests that this is a community who has the same questions as everyone else, but on top of that, there is also this historical issue. So there was a really great recent study. I don't know the author personally, but I'm going to plug the study because I liked it. They looked at different messaging strategies, and they found this preliminary, limited support, but good support for tailoring messages about vaccination. And so they took kind of standard messaging and they added acknowledgement about past mistreatment, as well as a brief note about the guardrails that have been put in place since then. And they found that approach actually had kind of some different outcomes. So it may be that strategies addressing vaccination intention, end up functioning well with something like community-specific concerns added in to the general messaging of the reasons people may be mistrustful. Hopefully, someone's working on more, but this article was written by Dr. Dhanani, Dhanani, and it's, I think, one of the first experimental studies I've seen looking at kind of tailored messaging about, medical mistrust and how that may factor into building trust in science, but also addressing and acknowledging kind of a different perspective.
Yeah, which is, it's a critical facet of outreach here, but I would say it's a critical facet of the public health, of any public health initiative that's aiming to address vaccine hesitancy. So for approaching people for a conversation about misinformation, what should be the goal of somebody who is trying to convince their vaccine hesitant loved ones to trust the science and get vaccinated?
I hesitate to tell people what their goal should be. I think that it's important to understand the reasons why people might choose not to get vaccinated, because everyone's going to have different reasons. I don't know if you're familiar with the counseling style, motivational interviewing, but I've seen a couple articles about using that style here, where it's basically about, the recognition that for most people, this is not true for all, but for most people, there is some kind of ambivalence about getting vaccinated, and they have reasons why they might want to, and they have reasons why they might not want to. And understanding those reasons can help us have kind of gentle conversations. If someone believes or is hesitant because they believe something that's clearly untrue, then we can have a conversation. Well, what kind of things could I show you that would convince you that this isn't true? And if they say nothing, well, that may not be a pathway to take. But if they say, well, if you show me this and this, then I think we could have that conversation, then that could be an approach. And the flip side is, you may find out that even if they perceive a risk from something that you may or may not think is really a risk, they may say, well, you know what, I'm willing to do it for my grandkids or something like that. And so I think that the most important thing is to be gentle and understanding, and to understand that behavior change is difficult, and everyone's coming from a place of ambivalence when they make decisions. And so acknowledging that ambivalence and understanding where that ambivalence comes from is going to be valuable. And the other thing I'll say, and I think this is something that's come up more and more in my own research, it's very important to be trustworthy. And so a short-term, I see this solution sometimes, a short-term gain, like getting like a brother vaccinated by deceiving them in any way, I think is a very, very dangerous approach to take. Again, that's just my personal opinion. But to me, I think when we're having these conversations, it's very important to be trustworthy, factual, and consistent, and to really stick with the evidence, and not to see the end as justifying the means, because that's going to, the means are going to be the way we have conversations with them throughout the rest of our relationship. And if we're deceptive here, then, we run the risk of ruining that dialogue for a long time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that last point. And I want to, before we move on to our next question, I want to remind everybody who may be attending, please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address them as soon as we see them. But for our next and last question, what do we, in your opinion, have yet to understand about COVID-19? Misinformation, or I guess you would say, you could also say belief in unsupported.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not that I think the term is bad. It's just like, I see a lot of these kind of acrimonious debates online where people are saying, well, you labeled this as misinformation, but are you really 100% sure? And it's like, well, there may be things where I'm very, very sure, but I'm rarely 100% sure. So I think embracing a language that can be articulate about uncertainty is at least to my opinion, pretty important, because it's not about, when people say trust the science, I'm not always sure what that means, because, a lot of times we're making decisions based on the best available evidence. And so acknowledging the uncertainty where it's like, we think, this is almost certainly true, or this is very likely to be true. Because this is true, if we want to achieve these other outcomes, we recommend you do something. But it's important to realize if people don't do that thing that's recommended, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't trust the science. It could be that they trust the science that you reported. They're saying, well, you know what, I believe face masks will help community spread, but I don't want to wear one. And so I don't think that disagreement with a public health recommendation is the same thing as not trusting a finding necessarily. And all that is to say, I think, what do we have yet to understand? A whole lot. The idea of misinformation and the social media environment in which it tends to proliferate is the whole environment is incredibly complex. And I know it may be frustrating to have someone on and they're just like, I'm not sure we know this, I'm not sure we know that, but there is just a lot that I think we still need to understand. And I think being honest and embracing uncertainty, even about discussing uncertainty, may, it may be to some degree frustrating, in the attempt to have a clear conversation. But I think in the long run, we benefit from being really meticulous about how we discuss things and draw definitive conclusions. And I think I get where people are coming from, when they see the same claim over and over and over again that they know is not true, or that they know is very unlikely to be true. It can feel very defeating to be faced day in and day out with the same claims, knowing that they're not likely to be true. So I think part of the complexity too is that scientists, doctors, and everyone else are human beings, just like the rest of us. And, there's going to be inevitable frustration in encountering misinformation or unsupported narratives because they're in many cases living it. And so I guess my pithy answer to this is there's a lot we have yet to understand. And I think one of the ways we get to that understanding is by having kind of empathetic, honest, and trustworthy dialogue about the complexities of these things and looking at, core ideas about what is it to know things. Who do you trust? If you ask me right now, if I, it's a hard, let me take a step back. It's a hard question for people to answer. If you ask them, if you had to make a decision about your health right now, what would you, what source would you check? And how sure are you? So I think building building a public forum or reinforcing public fora where trustworthy information is available may be important. Incentivizing truthful content may be important. Again, this is all speculation. Right now, much of revenue is generated by encouraging someone to click a button. And so that incentivizes certain kinds of behaviors. And so what if there were a way to financially incentivize in some way the accuracy of statements? And so I don't, we have a lot to learn. Hopefully I contributed something to your understanding today.
Very, very informative. And, I would say food for thought for anybody who's listening in. At this point, if there's, again, another reminder, if there's any questions anybody might have or comments, we'll take them if there are any. But that is basically the end of our session for this month's COVID-19 Empower Hour. Just gonna give it one more glance over to see if we have any questions. No, I think that's it. So yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Agley, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you and have these fruitful conversations. I hope that we can use the information that you talked about and the information you provided by talking with us to some extent as we work to increase vaccine rates here and hopefully build trust in science here in our communities.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you reaching out and having me on.
Thank you again, Dr. Agley, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Again, we'll have our English session for May 23rd, French session the 25th of May, and the Spanish session the 27th of May. But for this month, we will have our French session in the Wednesday for the French session, and then Friday for the Spanish session. So please tune in if you're a French or Spanish speaker those days. Thank you again.